finished, that's about all that was going to remain, was going to be a tent. Elsewhere, talk about the stump. The idea is God is going to bring such utter destruction that you're not going to be able to think of the dynasty of David as being palatial. It's going to be more like Coleman camping here. Okay? But the situation goes even deeper than that, because the idea of the tent of David has other Old Testament references. In fact, quite a few more Old Testament references that give us a better background into the idea that lies behind that phrase, the booth of David or the tent of David. In the book of Isaiah, chapter 7, and I think it's very interesting how this reference appears, the context in which it appears. Again, the Lord spoke to Ahaz, "Ask a sign of the Lord your God. Let it be as deep as Sheol or as high as heaven." But Ahaz says, "I will not ask, and I will not put the Lord to the test." And he said, "Hear then, O house of David." And the phrase is like the old booth of David, tent of David, house of David. "It is too little for you to weary men, that you may weary my God also. Therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. Behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and shall call his name Emmanuel." It's interesting how that appears, isn't it, brother? Now, why does he refer to the kingdom as the house of David? Because that phrase, house of David, talks about not just the immediate dynasty of David within his lifetime, but it talks about the people of God. It is used as not only a reference to the immediate dynasty when David was ruling, but to the people of Israel as a whole, and more specifically, the people of Judah, the tribe of Judah. They are referred to as the house of David. And in fact, I was going to mention, I didn't do all of the legwork I would have liked to have done on this, but if you go to the book of Matthew, where, Matthew is spending a lot of time portraying Christ as the king that would come in the lineage of David, that term occurs over and over and over and over again in the book of Matthew. There's hardly a chapter that does not mention the house of David. And it's in direct connection to the lineage of Christ and the fact that he is the king that would descend from David, that would sit on David's throne forever. Okay? So, this phrase, booth of David, is a phrase that is used in Amos not only just to denote the Davidic dynasty that has seen better days, but it's also used looking forward and backward at the people of God, and more specifically, the line of Judah. Okay? You see it again in Isaiah chapter 16, a few passages later. "Let the outcasts of Moab sojourn among you, be a shelter to them from the destroyer. When the oppressor is no more, and destruction has ceased, and he who tramples underfoot has vanished from the land, then a throne will be established in steadfast love, and on it will sit in faithfulness, in the tent of David," again, the booth of David, "one who judges and seeks justice and is swift to do righteousness." Now, who in the world could that be? Any ideas? Do you see the connections here? So in this passage in Amos, this idea of the booth of David then has very clear connections to the coming of the Messiah, as well as describing the people of Israel, the people of Judah. And it's important for us to understand and see that connection to the people of Judah, the people of God. Okay? Now, the next thing that we need to look at is this phrase, the house or the booth of David that has fallen. In this context of Amos, it is very, very clear that God is sending utter destruction on these people. And so even that tent, even that diminished structure of the Davidic dynasty is going to fall to the ground. You know, it's one thing to diminish from palatial ideas to tent ideas. It's one thing to go from living in the Taj Mahal to a Coleman pop-up. It's another thing when even the Coleman pop-up is going to be demolished. And that's the idea here, is God saying, I'm going to crush things about as close to utter as you can get without it being utter destruction. He said, I'm not going to completely destroy Judah. But it's going to be pretty close. It's going to be pretty severe. And so he says, and in this passage, of course, he's talking about raising up, but the booth of David, even the tent, has fallen. It's a way of really saying that the kingdom at this point has deteriorated to such an extent that it's really begun to be unrecognizable as a kingdom. And God says, I'm going to raise that back up. Now, I'm going to try to get on through this in just a minute, okay? Repair or raise up. This denotes the bringing back to life of what seems to have been completely destroyed. I'm going to raise it back up. I'm going to repair it. He talks about repairing the ruins later on. The understanding that what God is going to do is really, for all intents and purposes, is going to be something that seems impossible, that seems completely unable to be accomplished. The idea, by the way, guys, and this is going to have great implications for where we're going to be going next week with this, is, remember, the booth of David is not about buildings or structures, physical structures. It's about people. And the understanding is that God is going to bring such a complete destruction on Israel and Judah that by mankind's understanding, it will be impossible to raise it again. Now, when you start talking about people being destroyed, lineages being wiped out, what is it that comes to your mind here? And what happens when a particular family line is basically wiped out? How do you raise that back up? Thank you, Randy. I'm glad somebody was. You were all looking at me like, well, I don't know. That's the point. That's what God is saying here, is the destruction is going to be so terrible that from man's perspective, it's going to seem an impossibility. But then God says, I'm going to raise it back up. The booth of David is going to be fallen. It's not going to be a palace anymore. It's going to be a tent, and even that's going to be razed to the ground. And you understand what I mean when I say razed to the ground, torn to the ground.